I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Dennis Burnett, who will talk to us about milkweeds of the Carolinas. Dennis has an extraordinarily long history of involvement with the natural world. He's a retired community college professor and currently volunteers as a nature educator focusing on birds, butterflies, dragonflies, native plants, and ecosystems. Dennis has done numerous presentations for nature organizations, master gardeners, garden clubs, church groups, scouts, and so forth. He is past president of his local Audubon Society chapter and currently on the local Audubon board. He's past president of the Piedmont Bird Club and past president of the Carolina Bird Club. He's a former member of the County Open Space Program Committee. Currently, he's a former board member of the North Carolina Native Plant Society. And I only found this out recently, but Dennis, 20 years ago, founded the Carolina Butterfly Society in North and South Carolina. And we now have about 200 members in both the Carolinas and surrounding states. Dennis has been a serious birder for about 45 years and became interested in butterflies about 25 years ago. He's looked for and photographed birds, butterflies, and other wildlife in 11 countries in North America, Central America, South America, Europe, and Asia. As with many of us, he became an amateur photographer. His first camera was a Kodiak Brownie Hawkeye when he was around 10 years old. I don't remember that one. My first camera was an Instamatic.
That predates you.
As a teenager, he bought his first serious camera at a pawn shop with money earned from mowing lawns. Dennis is a recent recipient of the state of North Carolina's Order of the Longleaf Pine in recognition of volunteer service to the state. It is with great pleasure that I'm introducing Dennis Burnett to all of you.
Well, thank you. That was a very, very nice and long introduction.
Well deserved, Dennis. Well deserved.
But thank you. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint here in front of us. We're going to be talking about milkweeds. I know that you all know what milkweeds are. Sometimes, though, particularly people who are just beginning in this pursuit of ours, think that there's just one milkweed, and it turns out that there are lots of milkweeds. All right, so am I up?
It's not up, Dennis.
Okay, I see what my problem is here.
There you go.
I'm trying to get it to launch. There we go. Here we go. All right. So milkweeds are, people will say milkweed is the only plant that monarchs will eat. And actually, there's more than one milkweed. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. There are so many milkweeds, actually milkweed species, that I won't be able to cover all of them. So what I'm going to do is try to hit the highlights, ones that are either most common or at least most commonly seen in the Carolinas. North Carolina and South Carolina are roughly divided into coastal plains, sandhills, Piedmont, and mountains. And so we have different species of milkweeds that occur in all of these areas. So monarchs, depending on whose material you're reading, monarchs are either declining or increasing or are of concern. But I think that all of us would agree that they're at risk with global climate change and issues such as habitat destruction and that sort of thing. One of the things that people typically seem to overlook is that although milkweeds are the plant of choice for monarch caterpillars to eat, milkweeds actually provide important food sources for lots of different pollinators. And these pollinators also attract predators. And so a milkweed community, ecological community, may include as many as 20 or 25 different species of insects and other creatures. So milkweeds are very important to the environment beyond their connection with monarch butterflies. All right, so it turns out that there are probably more than 100 species of milkweeds if you count those in North America and Central and South America. Here in our area, we have fewer than that, but that may come as a surprise to you. Milkweeds, there are some species of milkweeds that will go into almost every kind of habitat, everything from standing water to dry areas, higher elevations, low elevations. There are some milkweed species that are adapted to full shade, others that can't grow in shade and have to be out in full sun. And one of the cool things for those of us who are gardeners is that we can easily grow several milkweed species in our gardens. And if we don't want a garden, or if we don't have the space, there are some milkweed species that do very well on patios and in small spaces like along the edge of a sidewalk. And so I like to promote growing milkweeds in containers or in these small micro gardens because they provide the same kind of benefits to insects and other creatures that they do if they're growing wild. So, we're going to try to focus in on these 18 species in the Carolinas, but I won't be able to spend a lot of time on every one of them. Milkweeds have unique flower structures. And so if you get in your mind a search pattern for this flower structure, and also for the seed pods or follicles, the chances are pretty good that you'll be able to identify milkweed, even if you have never seen these plants before. So if you look at the bottom of that slide, milkweeds are named for the milky sap, kind of a rubbery or latex material. The flower structure and the seed pods, and I mentioned before that those are actually called follicles. And then these little seeds that have a parachute on them, or something called a pappus that helps them float through the air, and it spreads them around within the habitat. So, looking at the flower structure, so I did not coin this phrase, but somebody coined the phrase "crown and skirt." And if you look at that this structure here, you can see what they're talking about. The sepals are the skirt, sepals and petals. The stamen and carpels above are the crown. And it doesn't matter what species of milkweed, true milkweed, that you're looking at, there's going to be that structure. Now, it may be that pieces of that flower are either larger or smaller, that are more available to see or less available to see. But the structure is going to remain the same. And here's a good example. Now, one of the cool things about milkweeds, if you're interested in plants, is that they have a very unusual method of spreading through the environment. An insect has to land on the flower. It has to accidentally stick its leg down through one of the slits, and then it can pick up what is called a pollinium, or a pair of pollinia that stick to the leg, and then it's got to be able to pull that leg back out of the flower and fly to the next flower and accidentally stick its leg down in one of the openings in the next flower. And so that raises the issue for me, how in the world has this plant survived all these years in order, to go through that process? Nevertheless, we do have lots of milkweeds in our area. Here are some examples that will show you what the follicle or the pod looks like. The one in the upper center is the common milkweed that most of us have seen. It doesn't occur, or at least not very much down toward the coast, but in the Piedmont and the upper elevations, you'll see that. And it has a very large pod or follicle. Now, I talked about how a milkweed community could involve 20 or 25 species of creatures. Here are some examples that thrive on milkweeds. You probably, if you have looked at milkweeds, you've probably seen aphids on them. This aphid is interesting in that it's called an oleander aphid. Oleanders don't grow here. That's a tropical or subtropical plant. There are oleanders in South Carolina, but when I say here now, I'm talking about in North Carolina where I'm located. So there are milkweed beetles, two different milkweed bugs. There is a moth, the milkweed tussock moth, in addition to the monarch butterflies. And I stuck a photograph in here of some of the nymphs of the milkweed bugs, just to show you the variety of things that you could see if you were to look at milkweeds in the field. As I said earlier, about 18 species of milkweeds are here in the Carolinas. And here are some examples of them. These are ones that I wanted to show you, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these. But no matter where you're wandering, whether it's in the high country of South Carolina, down toward the coast in the sandhills of the Carolinas, you're going to run across milkweeds. And so it would be kind of fun for you to get in your mind some of these characteristics that you could find on them. I have discovered, I'll say discovered and put that in quotation marks, milkweeds I have never seen before just by knowing what milkweeds look like. I may not know what to call them, although typically once you found a milkweed, you can look it up in a field guide. But it's kind of fun wandering around in areas that are not familiar to you and running across a plant that's in the milkweed group. Well, this doesn't seem to want to forward. All right. So let's do a gallery of milkweed species and just kind of familiarize ourselves with some of the more common ones. This monarch, by the way, you'll recognize as a female monarch. She has the wide veins. There are a couple of native species of Hymenoptera. There's a wasp on the left that's slightly out of focus and a bee on the right. This is a good indication these plants are very popular, very attractive to insects and that sort of thing. So let's start off with one that is in almost every area of both of our states, plus the surrounding area. And you can see this map shows it really very common in the on the eastern part of North America. This is that beautiful orange milkweed that we see along the sides of roads. This is one that really loves the sun and does not like damp areas. And so it's real common if you're out in a pasture someplace right out in the middle of bright sunshine and dry areas, you'll find this milkweed just blooming away and attracting all sorts of things. It's one of the few milkweeds that you can actually find in garden centers sometimes, either as a plant or more often as a packet of seeds. One thing I would caution you is that it likes sun and dry areas so much that it's easy to overwater this particular species. So I would put it in my yard, but not in the garden where I'm going to be watering lots of plants when we have dry spells, as we do in the Carolinas. It is mostly an orange plant, but you can see from these other two slides that you can occasionally find it in yellow and in a very pale orange. And by the way, I should mention that all of the photos that you see here are ones that I have shot, unless I've otherwise identified them to source. For instance, I have a couple of photos in here that Dave Kastner shot that were much better than my photos. And so we'll occasionally run across those. But here we can see, particularly on the photo on the right, why it's called butterfly weed. It really is a very, very attractive plant for butterflies. And like all milkweeds, it has the little parachutes attached to the seeds, the pappus. This photo on the left, if you look at the white arrow pointing, it's pointing to a caterpillar. Those caterpillars tend to blend right in, but that's the follicle of the milkweed, the butterfly milkweed. Well, that's not what I wanted to do. All right, good. Sorry, I'm still getting used to Zoom as well, so please bear with me. All right, so I just talked about probably the most common milkweed in the Carolinas. There is another milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, that is called common milkweed, and it is very common in the parts of the east that are north of South Carolina. It does occur in the part of South Carolina that is the high country. It's much more common in North Carolina, and then you can see that it gets even more common as you go further north. This is that tall milkweed that you see along the side of the road in the upper Piedmont and higher elevations. It has this mauve cluster of flowers. Those flowers are aromatic, and so sometimes if you are walking through a pasture or along the woodland edge, you'll get this scent that to me smells a little bit like baby powder. It smells differently to different people, but it's a very pleasant smell. These spread by rhizomes as well as by seeds, and so you'll run across sometimes large patches of these, and it's fun to station yourself next to one of these with these beautiful pink flowers, these mauve flowers, and watch what these flowers bring in. Many of the butterflies in our area use this plant for nectar, even though the milkweed is the host plant for monarchs. It tends to grow in full sun, although it's not as picky as the butterfly milkweed that I showed you a few moments ago. It's tall, and so what you often find, and I find this if I'm driving along the Blue Ridge Parkway, there will be a field in mid to late summer that has grown up in grasses, and this milkweed sticks its flowers up above those grasses. So it's well designed to be in large prairie or grassy areas. This is also the one, let's see what I have next here. Yeah, this is the one that a lot of people like to go to collect seeds. if you want to try to grow this in your garden, I would caution you that if you get it started, it will spread very easily. And so we have friends who tend to either grow it along a sidewalk or a driveway where it can be managed, or along a fence row. You'll see in that lower left photo a whole patch of milkweed that has gone to seed, and you can see those follicles. Very easy to collect these seeds. Problem is that only about 10% of these seeds are viable. And so if you were to try to plant these, I would suggest trying to start them in a container. You would need a lot more seeds to try to get something to grow than you would normally expect with other plants. So, 10% would be out of 100 seeds, maybe 10 seeds would be viable. So we've already talked about this, but I wanted to show you what the caterpillar looks like, and also what the chrysalis looks like in the center. It looks like a piece of jade jewelry, beautiful chrysalis. So let's move on to another very common milkweed. We've talked about the orange butterfly weed. We've talked about the pink or the mauve common milkweed. The swamp milkweed has a pink flower or batch of flowers, very pink. There is a white version of it that occasionally shows up. I have actually seen that in garden centers, and it's a named variation called ice ballet if you buy it in a lawn and garden store. But this is a well-known one. It doesn't mind having its toes wet. It really, I don't think it occurs in the lower part of South Carolina. Dave Kastner, have you seen it down in that area? The swamp milkweed?
I think we've got a little bit in our garden.
Yeah. So maybe from about Columbia, South Carolina north would be where you most commonly find it. Beautiful plant. If you had a low area that stayed damp occasionally, this would be a good plant for that. I'm not talking about standing water, but just a damp area. It does form colonies like many of the other milkweeds do. And even though the follicles, the seed pods, are more narrow than the common milkweed, it's really easy to collect seed. And actually the germination rate for this particular plant is much better than the common milkweed. I guess if I were going to put two milkweeds in my yard, I would put the orange butterfly milkweed away from the garden, but in a nice sunny, dry area. And then I would put this one in my garden where I'm going to hit it with some water during the drier part of the summer, because it'll do just fine in normal garden soil. And here's what the follicles look like. There is another milkweed that actually is called aquatic milkweed, or sometimes called white swamp milkweed. It does like its feet wet. It will grow in standing water. This is, you notice if you look at the map at South Carolina, about around Columbia, around the fall line, north is where you might find the pink flowering swamp milkweed. And from the fall line south in the sandhills and coastal area is where you'd be more likely to find the aquatic milkweed. Those of us in North Carolina are going to have to go butterflying in South Carolina to see it, which I intend to do, by the way, once we get a chance to do some traveling. But this is a very attractive milkweed to butterflies, probably one of the most common milkweeds for butterflies to lay their eggs on. You'll notice that the follicle is shaped a little differently. So this is Asclepias perennis. Clasping milkweed occurs in both Carolinas, sometimes called bluntleaf milkweed. You can see the Carolinas are here on the right. It has the typical milkweed crown and skirt flower shape, but these flowers tend to be nodding. That is, they tend to dip over a bit. You'll notice that it's called clasping. If you look at the leaves, you notice that they are clasping themselves around the stem of the plant. This is one that can take some shade. It also can take open sun. You'll often find these along woodland edges. They do form colonies, although not massive colonies like the common milkweed. All right, so here are some other photos of the clasping leaves, Asclepias amplexicaulis. Now, this is in Dave and Marty's backyard, and so I had to put this in here and use Dave's photo. I have only seen this particular plant, Asclepias tomentosa, which means fuzzy, by the way, the velvet milkweed, just a few times. It's a cool little plant, and this is a cool photo that Dave shot. You must have gotten down on the ground, Dave, and acted acted like a butterfly.
Well, my camera has a tilt screen, so I didn't have to get right down on the ground.
Okay, good. Well, you can see that crown and skirt formation. You don't often see green flowers on a flowering plant, and yet this is a beautiful little plant. Actually, this is a perfect example of the type of habitat that it loves. It likes these pine woods, sandy, well-drained soil. It can take full shade, and it's a cool plant. If you live in an area that has sandy, well-drained soil, it would be worth giving it a try if you can find seed pods. The problem is that it seems to be throughout the sandhills and coastal area, but scattered. Here you can see, again, this is in the Kastner yard. You can see that there are several plants, but it doesn't form a big patch like the common milkweed. Excuse me. All right, let's go on to one that also occurs in the sandhills. Got a little tickle in my throat, sorry. This is a well-named plant, either sandhills or pine woods milkweed, Asclepias humistrata. Oh, let me back up for a second. And you'll see the coverage. It's in the sandhills and coastal plain of both Carolinas on down into Florida. I have seen this growing in Florida. In fact, it goes all the way down to just slightly below the frost line in Florida. Beautiful plant. It's a plant that falls over. I guess you would term it a prostrate growing plant. It gets fairly large, has those purplish or lavender veins, and these beautiful white to lavender flowers. It's really a very attractive plant, and it's very recognizable. This is one that I found and identified on my own, and had to look it up in a field guide. But it's a fun thing to be able to do, to wander around and find things like that. All right, whorled milkweed, Asclepias verticillata, is sort of the opposite. You'll see here in the Carolinas that in the sandhills and coastal plain, there's not much of it there. Above the fall line is where you find whorled milkweed. This is an unusual one in that the leaves are not broad like most of the other milkweeds. Very narrow-leaved, beautiful white flowers. This one grows quite well in containers, but when it isn't in bloom, when it doesn't have the seed pods on it, you'll see the lower left corner. It really is inconspicuous. It grows to be about 18 inches to 2 feet tall, but and it grows well, as I said, in a container, but it's hard to find unless it's actually in flower or has these narrow follicles on it. It's another one of those that will do quite well in sunny, dry areas. It would grow okay in your garden, but if you wanted to plant it away from your garden so that it doesn't get too much water, it would do just fine too. It tends to attract lots of different pollinators, and so it would be a good one to have maybe in small spaces. And if you don't have full sun all day long, you might try it even in a place that is partly shady, because I grew it on my deck in a container, and my deck only got about 4 or 5 hours of sun in the summertime. So it does fairly well, I think. This is what it looks like when you first get it started in a container. Over on the right, you can see several different species of milkweeds, and in the center between the butterfly milkweed and the purple milkweed, you'll see an area that it has the whorled milkweed. That's another one of those narrow space areas. Okay, so I have kind of zipped through these very quickly, but I wanted to leave enough time for us to be able to chat about some of these things. So see if we have any questions. That's the end of my presentation. How much time do we have left? I don't have a clock going here.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left, and there are quite a few questions that have come through via the chat.
Okay, well, since we have a little bit of time, this was not a part of the presentation, but let me say something about tropical milkweed, and then we'll get to that. Tropical milkweed is not native to North America. You can see that it grows a little out in Southern California, and also down in the Gulf area, South Carolina, Texas, and on around into Florida. But there was some concern about growing this. This has escaped and grows wild in South Florida. Here in our area, for most of us, maybe not in the far southern part of South Carolina, but this will die down to the ground. It may come back from the roots, excuse me, or it may come back from seeds, but it is very attractive to butterflies. The concern was that if it still has vegetative material above ground, if it hasn't died back, that it could spread diseases to monarch butterflies. I think that is not an issue for those of us in the Carolinas, but you can get this. This is probably the one that's most frequently sold in lawn and garden centers, and those folks often don't know that it is not native. I think that if you have some, leave it. I don't think it's going to be a problem. There are plenty of other native species, though, that you could plant that would be just as attractive to butterflies. You can see that it comes not only in that orange or red-orange color, but also yellow. But anyway, let's leave it at that. That gives us that extra little thing there. So, all right. So
All right. Thank you very much, Dennis. That was very interesting. I know a lot of us have attempted to grow various species of milkweeds with varying degrees of success. So let's get to some of these questions that came in via the chat feature. Do you have a I think you already covered some of this, but what would be your top 3 recommendations for species that would readily adapt to container gardening in our area?
I personally have grown common milkweed, which gets very tall. That's the one that gets, head high in good conditions. You would need a large container for that. I'm not sure I would put that as number 1, but I have grown that. I've talked about whorled milkweed. That's a really good one. The one that I would like to grow, but I have not had success with it, is the orange flowering butterfly milkweed. It has a very long taproot, and that taproot is very sensitive. So if you were to disturb it, like trying to move it, for instance, you could easily lose it. So my advice to you is to, if you want to try the butterfly milkweed, put it in a deep container, or put it someplace out in the sun, and just leave it where, put it where you want to keep it and leave it there. It's a short-lived perennial, so it might live there for 3 or 4 years and die back. However, it does reseed itself quite well. So if you can get a patch going, you could have that patch going for several years, and it wouldn't be a problem. Common milkweed, yes, I've tried and been successful. Swamp milkweed, the one with the pink flowers, even if it doesn't grow in your area, would do well in a large pot. But keep in mind that when you're growing things in containers, you have to provide the water for it. Don't rely on rain. And particularly with swamp milkweed, you would need to water it more often than you water other plants, just because it likes to have its toes damp. Trying to think of others. I think those are the ones I would start off with.
Okay.
Anything that you could find the pods for and have the seeds for, you could try those.
All right. Well, that was another question I had, the source for the seeds. They're hard to find, but let's get to some questions that Jock Stender submitted. He would like to know, when do the milkweeds start blooming, and how long do they bloom?
That's not an easily answered question, because like I said, we have about 18 species of milkweeds in the Carolinas. One that I did not highlight, although I showed you a picture of it early on, Asclepias variegata. It sounds like it would be variegated, but it's really not. It's called red ring. Somebody needs to mute their computer, because we're getting a lot of extraneous noise. At any rate, the Asclepias variegata grows in full shade in the woods, and it's the earliest blooming milkweed in my area. So it will start blooming earlier than everything else, all the other milkweeds. And each of the milkweeds has its own bloom time. They overlap, but I can't give you just one answer to when these milkweeds bloom. See, what was the other? How long do they bloom? Typically, because there are clusters of flowers, they have a long bloom period. So the orange flowering butterfly milkweed that both Carolinas have may bloom throughout the summer. Starting in June or late May, and blooming all the way through up until September, perhaps. So that would be a good one to have in your yard. That just don't water it too much. Okay. Allison, you're muted.
Sorry. Jock would also like to know about transplanting various Asclepias species. If a friend has many growing in her garden and wants to give me some, is it possible to safely dig it up and successfully plant it in my garden?
Yes, I would say that the overall answer, the general answer is yes. I've already mentioned that the one that's most difficult to transplant is the orange flowering butterfly milkweed. The whorled milkweed is probably the easiest to transplant. The root system is just like the leaves are fine, almost needle-like. The roots are fine. The common milkweed, of course, Jock lives further down in South Carolina. I'm not sure that it grows down there, but the common milkweed has rhizomes, and I've transplanted that several times, but it may not grow in that sandy soil down there. I haven't had any experience with that. And other people jump in here if you've had experience with it. One of the most beautiful milkweeds, and one that is rare in my part of the world, is purple milkweed. And that will grow quite well and transplant really well. One of the people on this Zoom, Marie Petit, has a patch of purple milkweed that grows really well and blooms very nicely, and it's very attractive not only to butterflies but to humans. People love looking at it. So that would be a good one, particularly if if you could get a mature plant.
Okay, some other questions, Dennis. From Sharon, being non-native, doesn't tropical milkweed confuse the monarchs on their migration?
Probably not, because I think monarchs are not, don't have to identify which milkweed species it is. What they're looking for is a place to lay their eggs, and so that their caterpillars will have something to eat. And so I think this is not an issue. Also, in most of the Carolinas, maybe not coastally, but most of the Carolinas, the tropical milkweed will die down to the ground, and that's a natural process. So when the plants have died down, they're no longer available to the monarchs. We also find that monarch migration is a bit more complex than many of us have thought for years. There are some monarchs that apparently stay in the Carolinas and don't migrate. It's very likely that that's the case all along the South Carolina border on down into Georgia, and I know that it is in Florida because I've seen a supposed non-migratory group of monarchs down in Florida. That I saw one emerging from a chrysalis down in Florida. So I think that that's not going to be an issue. Again, though, if you don't want to grow the tropical milkweed, don't. If you're nervous about it. But I think that it's probably not as big a problem as at first people thought that it was going to be in terms of passing disease on to the monarch butterflies. Harry LeGrand is on here too. Harry, you could pitch your ideas in there if you like.
Yeah, I am, but I'm responding to a photo.
Oh, okay.
The one thing I saw, I was seeing something about that when you passed up the butterfly weed, the orange milkweed. Can everybody hear me? You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It is an extremely important nectar source, the main one for the coral hairstreak. So it's almost a waste of time to look for that butterfly anywhere else. So you find yourself a power line clearing or an old field, and you almost have to look for orange.
Yeah.
And because I don't see coral hairstreak, I see it. I mean, I've seen them a few other places, but I know Will talks about zebra swallowtail loves milkweeds, but the coral hairstreak almost goes right to the orange milkweed, the butterfly weed.
So Harry, while I've got you pinned down here, do you have any problem with people planting the tropical milkweed?
I try to stay away from that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Let Loretta and you guys who are gardeners do that. I don't know too much about it. You know, I see monarchs on it here and there.
Yeah.
But I try to stay away from that because I'm not an expert on gardening, non-native plants and what they can do. So
Okay.
I'll let you and some others handle that one.
Well, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I did. Loretta, you were waving your hand.
Yes, I have a question. As far as the milkweed, I have grown the tuberosa, the bright orange milkweed, swamp milkweed before. And after several years, both species of milkweed beetles have completely decimated the milkweed that they're on. And I've looked it up, and they lay their eggs in the ground over the winter, so that they're already there when my milkweed blooms in the spring. And I've gotten so discouraged that I'm just about to give up on milkweed. But I have a question. If I plant it in a dry scrabble dirt, will it do better than in my garden? But swamp milkweed as well. We have irrigation system for the swamp milkweed. Maybe if it was in a drier place, would the beetles still find it? Apologies for that question. If anybody can help, please.
Harriet, are you trying to answer, Harriet?
No.
Okay. I have grown the Asclepias tuberosa, the orange flowering
Right.
milkweed, in my yard at the top of a hill in partial shade, partial sun. And it grew for several years fairly well there. Now we've moved away from that house. We're in a townhouse now, but I have not tried it here in our new townhouse.
Okay.
But
Dennis, I saw Cindy had her hand up, and I'm going to make a quick comment before.
okay.
Pertaining to Harry's comment about the coral hair streaks, Will Stewart finds them all the time down at the Carolina Sandhills in South Carolina. And when we were down there a couple times, he pointed out a couple to us, and they were on the milkweed, Harry. That's exactly where they were.
Yeah.
So, I've got some really nice pictures of coral hair streaks on that bright orange flower. It's a perfect attractant for them.
He came back to that same plant several years in a row, Dave.
Yeah.
Same place.
Yep. They go back to the same plant, same area, years in a row, is what Will just said, right?
Okay, we've got, it looks like 9:58 to me. I guess time for one more question, Allison.
Sure.
Cindy had her hand up too. So.
Okay, Cindy. I can't see Cindy on my screen.
Okay, I was just gonna say that when I see the milkweed bugs, and I like the beetles, the hard beetles, because there's only a few of those. So I'm willing to share my milkweed with those. But the soft-bodied beetle that you showed in your picture, they usually lay like 50 eggs or 100 eggs. So when I see that invasion, what I do is I just break off that particular piece of the milkweed and toss it in the burn pile.
Yeah.
So that's how I take care of the problem.
Yeah. They also, though, will lay eggs underneath, and so you don't even know they're there until all of a sudden you get all this little black stuff like the aphids leave. But by that time, your plant is already completely infested. So
Insecticidal soap that you can buy at lawn and garden centers is one way to control, not to get rid of, but to control aphids as well as the milkweed bugs. So
okay, but
you get it in a spray bottle and just spray it.
Yes, but if you do that, will can your caterpillars still eat that if it has insecticidal soap on it?
Well, I wouldn't spray it on the caterpillars. I'd spray it on the aphids. And,
No, but they're going to eat the plant that you're spraying.
I haven't had any trouble with that, but if you have, then I'll go with your better judgment.
No, it's a question. It's still a question to me that if you're spraying something for the insects, for the aphids, is it still going to affect the caterpillars that hatch, say first instar already or something?
Yeah.
I mean, you
I
can't.
have read that if you spray the insecticidal soap, that you should not spray it on plants that are hosts for caterpillars.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that
I don't
makes
remember where I read that, but that's,
Okay, thank you. That
That's-
helps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think we ought to have more opportunities for us to share ideas like this, maybe some more Zoom sessions during the year. So I'm going to turn this over to Allison now. Thank you all for your attention. This was fun. I've never shown this presentation to anybody before. So you're the first. You're my guinea pigs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Dennis. That was really interesting and beautiful photos too.
Thank you.